It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Anne Barlow. Anne is the director of Tate St. Ives, where she oversees its program of exhibitions, displays, residencies, commissions, education, and research, and has curated the exhibitions with artists including Małgorzata Meigatas, Uti Pieski, Tan Nguyen Phan, Petri Thilalai, Otobong Nakanga, and Huguette Kalong. Barlow was formerly Director of Art in General New York and held curatorial roles at the New Museum and Glasgow Museums, Scotland. Across these roles, she's organized numerous exhibitions, public programs, and international collaborations. She's initiated award-winning programs including Museum as Hub at the New Museum and the What Now Symposia at Art in General, both of which I know we'll hear some more about today. Barlow has published and lectured widely and was curator of the 5th Bucharest Biennale, co-curator of the Latvian Pavilion at the 55th Venice Biennale, and curator of the Samdani Art Award at the 2023 Dhaka Art Summit. She's also served on numerous selection panels and juries, including the Kim Residency Award, Riga, Exposure 8 at Beirut Art Center, MAC International in 2018 in Belfast, the British Pavilion of the 58th Venice Biennale, and the 2023 Ars Fenica Award in Helsinki. So we welcome you, Anne. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to give my enormous thanks to Priyanka and Pratik and the entire Experimenter team for this wonderful invitation and for making all of us feel so welcome. For this session, I was asked by Ratan to reflect on 3 key questions. What are the animating impulses across my practice? What are the ways of bringing these together in a way that might not seem at first connected or apparent? And where am I currently at? And these might seem simple, but in fact they were not. So while I just wanted to mention that while I'm going to focus on my institutional roles to address these questions, the independent projects that you mentioned that I have undertaken alongside those roles, such as the 5th Bucharest Biennale or the Samdani Award in Dhaka, have been incredibly significant, and I always see these as kind of vital complements, if you like, to that core institutional work. But moving directly to the 3 roles that Ratan asked me to talk about, these are 3 very different institutions, and I just put bullet points to kind of differentiate them from one another. They each have their own unique histories and contexts, and they also vary widely in scale, resources, and structures. And sometimes when, as a curator, you work across several organizations, you may or may not be entirely conscious that these threads keep reoccurring, but in fact they really do. And so these are the 3 threads that I picked out that have really been consistent across everything that I've done. And first and foremost is the supporting the creation of new work by artists, primarily through commissions, but also through residencies and other kinds of formats. Collaborations and networks have again crossed all 3, and the important part of those has been the sustained dialogue and the kind of issues and topics that we have been able to address by being more than one institution. And that has inevitably led to conversations and kind of critiques, if you like, about institutional identity and the definition of institutional evolution. So it's perhaps worth considering, in looking at this, the spirit and the values of these organizations in terms of what attracted me to them. The New Museum was founded in 1977 by Marcia Tucker, who formerly worked at the Whitney Museum of American Art, but wished to create a more independent contemporary art museum in New York because she felt that the kinds of work that she wanted to present was simply not possible in some of the major museums at the time. And I found Marcia Tucker, as then a very young curator I was, truly inspiring in terms of her radical vision and her experimental exhibitions program. And alongside, they had also established something called the Visible Knowledge Program, which was an innovative educational model that embedded artists in non-art curricula across New York schools, moving way beyond traditional art education. So it was an art institution that was consistently questioning museum practices, such, for example, as keeping education and curatorial teams quite separate. And that kind of thinking was of real interest to me. So I joined the new museum at a time when it decided to focus on creating a space for artists working in digital media. And while these practices had been happening in many parts of the world, interestingly, this was one of the first spaces in New York to be clearly devoted to that. So I was involved in creating some of the first shows for this. And this is here really to say that this connected me directly with emerging practices as well as current theory. And it really felt like a space for artists to learn from one another and for us as curators to consider how to communicate these new practices to audiences who had varying degrees of knowledge. I'm going to focus on Museum as Hub because this was another key initiative alongside, if you like, classic exhibition making. It very much reflected the time in which it was conceived, but it was nonetheless a very meaningful experiment in terms of testing out not only curatorial thinking, but also how the museum worked overall. The purpose of the Hub was to investigate new ways of connecting with other organizations and artist initiatives internationally, and engaging with audiences in ways that were outside the traditional exhibition-making format. The Hub itself was developed through a series of interdisciplinary think tanks, actually over a period of 2 years, with curators, designers, educators, architects, and specialists in publishing and new media, because they had much more expertise in galvanizing networks and could help us open up that thinking. And alongside, a lot of research was done by the wider team on the work of nonprofits internationally, both large and small. In the first iteration, as you can see, this involved these five institutions in different parts of the world, and the bullets on the right essentially reflect the different ways in which that group worked with one another. Alongside, the new museum had also a physical space that was more flexible social space, designed to engage audiences through presentations, screenings, symposia, and participatory practices, which is perhaps one of the newest elements of that program. And the Hub also offered a more collaborative way of working, with the opportunity for curators involved in these institutions to curate across the different sites. So I became Director of Art in General in 2007, just literally after this kind of initiation and development period. And in subsequent years with the curators who took over my role, the Hub really did engage with multiple organizations, artists, communities, researchers and thinkers, until as a methodology, if you like, it was integrated into the museum's overall way of working. So as a discrete program, it essentially became absorbed into wider thinking. So this is Art in General, what was Art in General at the time in just off Canal Street in downtown Manhattan. And you can see here the corner, it's a storefront space on a corner, and then you had to go up to the 6th floor. So it was like a kind of classic Soho kind of building. And it was established in 1981 in the same era as other so-called alternative spaces that sprang up in New York in the late 70s and early 80s. And what drew me to this institution at that time was its commitment to emerging artists and the more socio-political nature of its programming, something that continued to reflect the era in which it was founded. It was also really seen as a hub for artists, and it had the remit of supporting the commissioning of new work that would not necessarily be supported by larger museums and galleries or within a commercial context, something I was really drawn to. So the New Commissions program was the core program of our institution and involved close collaboration and lengthy conversations with artists in order to realize their vision, such as this project with Marwa Arsanios, whose physical form of exhibition continued to shift and evolve across various spaces, from Kunsthalle Lissabon, Portugal, to Art in General in New York, to afterwards to Beirut. And then with Deneo Seshi Bopapi, that involved a very extensive research and production process. To perhaps exemplify the kind of project that Art in General was really dedicated to in terms of the kind of practices we supported, I'd like to focus on this project by the artist Jill Magid. And Art in General supported Jill Magid at a time when few other arts organizations in New York would have become involved with this. This project was called Women with Sombrero, and it was actually, we didn't know it then, but it was to be the first of an ongoing multimedia project entitled the Barragan Archives, which examined the legacy of Mexican architect Luis Barragan, whose professional archive was acquired by Vitra in Switzerland. Magid wanted to explore the question of what does it mean for a corporation to own an artist's legacy, but she was refused access to the professional archive to carry out the research. So instead, she inserted gestures and invitations to make space for what she could not know or see. Exploring the intersection between national identity and repatriation, international property rights and copyright law, she reimagined and represented in material form things from the archive based on its legal status and avoiding copyright infringement. For Art in General, supporting the project meant consulting with legal experts, examining the risks to the artist and the institution, and having constant dialogue with the artist around each element in this exhibition. And one of the things that Jill was also really preoccupied with was that when the archive shifted to Vitra, they actually eliminated the accent on Barragan's name, so effectively erasing his cultural identity. And this was also very much part of her project. So this slide shows the 6th floor. It was one large space in Art in General, but we also sometimes worked outside. And this is just to give you an idea of, it was our 25th anniversary, and perhaps unusually, by the time I arrived, we had already received an invitation from the UBS Bank in Midtown in Manhattan to have our exhibition there. So it was kind of like an interesting pairing of this tiny, scruffy non-profit from downtown entering the arena of this corporate environment. And we did consider doing a traditional retrospective, and then in the end decided that for each of the bays on the ground floor of this bank, we would actually commission projects that directly engaged with audiences in perhaps quite unusual ways. So here you see Surasi Kusalwong's work, Ping Pong, New York Common Sense, which was open to being played, and also Anna Parvacci's mock money laundering service at the tips of your fingertips towards a clean money culture that engaged, as you can see, both audiences and the UBS staff. So this was a really surprising and interesting set of interventions. Alongside, this was a program I inherited when I arrived in Art in General, but it was a really important one because while working with artists was at our core, collaborating with other institutions was increasingly important. In some cases, these were a natural outcome of the commissioning process, and in others, they were the result of a desire to expand institutional thinking and collectively explore new ideas. So this program was a two-way residency exchange program, so artists from New York were offered the opportunity to go to a host venue in any of these organizations that you see listed here, and vice versa, artists from those countries were invited to come to New York and create a project in whatever medium or form. But I wanted to mention that as host institutions, it also offered sustained multi-year dialogue based on real relationships and trust. And so by 2012, in response to the shifting socio-political context of many of those institutions and the area of artist residencies and art networks more broadly, it felt necessary to reassess the program model. So we were in the process of examining this, and these are a couple of projects that happened after that re-examination, where we worked with each other in different ways after we reassessed this program. We became more actively involved in existing projects and programs that each other was running. And we also, for example, offered one of the institutions like a year-long residency on our own space that they could curate inside it. So this Eastern European Residency Exchange Program became a really interesting model for how to think about residencies differently. Alongside, this is the importance of chance in one's life. At the same time as we were thinking about all of this, Art in General went to visit Beirut and Cairo, And it was an institution that we found incredibly interesting and inspiring. And they were having a meeting with these other institutions at the time that were really focusing on institutional identity and purpose. And in a sense, this gives larger context to the discussions we were having around programmatic formats or exhibitions or residencies. And so a core goal of this group, which we called April because it's the month that we met, it was really as simple as that, was to take valuable time out of production-focused activity to question how institutions like our own could evolve and change, and how working together might open up new possibilities. And our first joint endeavour was to write for the summer 2013 Quarterly of Arte East as part of an editorial framed by Beirut in Cairo. And we were one of the oldest institutions in this group, so we asked ourselves these questions in terms of what it means to inherit an institution and how do you make sure that it continues to evolve. And then also, you're going to leave it at some point, and your team will leave it at some point. So how do you take care of it sufficiently and in a meaningful way to allow possibilities for other people to take it on? And what kinds of alternative futures might you leave room for? So all of this led to as well as listening to the concerns directly of artists. So these were themes that were really very much to the fore from 2014 to 2016, not only in Europe but also internationally. And we developed this 3-year program called What Now, which was a series of symposia that we did in collaboration with the Vera List Center for Art and Politics in New York, which of course brought in perspectives from many other fields, including sociology, science, and philosophy. And we also commissioned a series of projects and programs at Art in General, both online and physical, that reflected some of these wider concerns as we were moving through these themes. So this was a really interesting exercise of having concurrent, real, rigid, and well, rigorous, I would say, discourse alongside supporting artists who were working with some of these issues. And interestingly, each of these kind of organically led into one another. So the notions of collaboration and collectivity brought up, of course, the importance of listening, and really deep listening, which led to the Politics of Listening symposium in 2015. And because of the ideas of self-determination that came out of that, we developed the next session, which was around on future identities, which looked at constructions of the self, queer theory, mutability, the body, technology, and the ever-evolving relationship between the digital and the material. And what I think this 3-year project or 3-year program showed us was that growing or evolving doesn't always have to be about expansion. It can be, but it can also be about editing things out of your organizations or programs and doing it more deeply. So in stark contrast, as you can see with those two models, they are essentially non-collecting institutions, and that is one of many differences between my 2 jobs in New York and where I am now. It's also the size and sense of place. New York obviously is a very metropolitan city. St. Ives is a very small post-industrial community in a rural region in England. And I find myself in a place where tourism really takes over in the summer, and then you encounter your local and regional audiences in the spring and the autumn seasons. It may look really beautiful in the slides I'm about to show you, but what's important to say is that socioeconomic deprivation is a real reality in this wider region. It's one of the poorest regions in the whole of Europe, as is the lack of access to infrastructures that are more prevalent in larger cities. So this is another real contrast. I'm showing you this slide because Tate's first relationship with Cornwall came in 1980 when it took over the running from the family estate of the Barbara Hepworth Museum and Sculpture Garden. And this really is, for any of you who haven't seen it, it's a really beautiful oasis in the middle of the town. But Tate St. Ives itself is here. You can see the little red tip of the very, very west of England. It's about as far as you can go on that side. And it's there because at the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, Barbara Hepworth, Nam Gabo, Ben Nicholson, and other artists moved there. And Tate began to acquire work by several of these modern artists. And over the years, way before I got there, it had decided that it would be important to have a Tate site based in Cornwall that would celebrate these histories. And the gallery opened in 1993, but due to the number of visitors that came, they created this expansion of the gallery. So there is a physical expansion in this instance. And you can see here the thing on the left with the round shape is the original building, and that houses Tate collection works. And the one with the kind of 6 skylight roofs on the right is the new gallery. So in this instance, it really did double the space that we could use. But this was very important because in previous years, the curators had to decide whether to use the existing building for contemporary or modern, and now we have the opportunity to create a really vibrant program that creates conversations across each of these. So this is our situation. You can see the round loggia here, and then behind those 6 skylights of the new gallery. And just a few internal shots. And this is, I wanted to put this up because it has a very specific mission. So it has a mission to celebrate and consistently reevaluate these key figures, but also contextualize them within broader art histories. And at the same time, because we're so rooted in place, there's another real difference from being in New York, where you are in a place, but your work isn't necessarily about your neighborhood or about your direct community, but in this case it really is. So these are kind of 4 of the main goals, and I just want to quickly go through some of the slides, some of the shows that we have done. So in terms of revisiting modernism, it not only means representing the work of Barbara Hepworth and Nam Gabo and Patrick Heron and others, it also means bringing in the work of other artists who were working at the same time as many of these artists. And this is a show by Huguette Caland from 2019. And we worked with external curators here in this instance for the Casablanca Art School, which again was another example of kind of revisiting these global art histories. Happy to go through these too quickly, but this is Otmon Kanga, who created several new works while she was with us in Tate St. Ives, and also wanted to create a performance, and in this instance she collaborated on the left, as you can see, with young people, but also with people called bards. And bards are Cornish, they basically protect Cornish language and culture. And because of these issues around language extraction, mining, this was a project that was really important for her to do alongside her show. This is a solo show that we did with the artist Oti Pieski. Just keep moving. Another one with her. Hague, just a brief moment on Hague. This was interesting because sometimes it's the artists themselves that, was really interesting hearing your talk, Pooja, because Hague, quite unexpectedly, became really entranced by the work of Lee Wan Chia in the Tate collection, and ended up devoting one room of her own show to this artist, which I've never seen before. And these figures here that you see were actually derived from her interest in the modernist artists associated with St. Ives, Hepworth, Gabo, and Hepworth and Gabo. And this, I think, was a really intriguing work because she felt an affinity with Lee Wan Chia across space and time. So there are many opportunities to kind of really think through what those goals are. This is a project, what did I do? By Petrit Halalai. Oh, let's see. I'm showing this because it was one of the largest productions that we did, and it was really because of COVID. We originally were going to bring selections of his work to Cornwall that really spoke to issues of rurality, of community, and in fact, because of course you couldn't borrow anything during that time and transport was impossible, what this gave the artist was this incredible opportunity that was quite difficult and challenging, was to really revisit the scenes he had witnessed of the Kosovo War when he was 13 years old, and these are some of his original drawings. And what he did is he created some of these drawings in felt that were suspended from the ceiling, that gave both these beautiful kind of, imagining and escapist, if you like, feelings or drawings that he was making as he was witnessing the horrors of the war, alongside the reality of violence. And this obviously was an exhibition that touched many people. And I think it's important to say that not every exhibition and not every artist has to relate to the ideas of place. You know, we're also inviting artists whose work we think speak to really important and timely issues. And this is Hera Butashian, who did an artist residency with us. It's important to say that Tate St. Ives is the only Tate site that has a dedicated artist residency. So it really gives artists the opportunity to come and stay and develop new work, again, in any medium. Just a nod to another network. This time it's really brand new, and this is really interesting because it has a lot of organizations that are not necessarily based in cities. So for us, this really speaks to our locality, which is really important, and to the issue of climate change and sustainability, which is a massive issue for Cornwall, but also, of course, for many other parts of the world, if not even more so. So this is a project that we've just launched, so I can't speak more about it, but it is just to indicate that over the next 6 years, this will be a major part of our work and research. And then lastly, I wanted to pull up the Palais de Danse. This is right opposite the Barbara Hepworth Museum and Sculpture Garden, and it is a second studio that she acquired in 1961. And it has this really important social history as a former dance hall and a former cinema. And so the people of St. Ives really have strong feelings about it and its legacy. And we have a really interesting proposition now, because we want to preserve and reflect on the legacy of Barbara Hepworth as an artist. And this is how she used the dance floor when she occupied that studio. And this is where she made some of the larger scale works, such as the single form, which is outside the UN, and also the winged figure outside John Lewis. And you can see the massive challenge of taking big sculptures through the tiny streets of St. Ives here. And then single form outside the United Nations in New York. But this is the slide that I really want to focus on, because alongside celebrating this artist's legacy, there is this whole social history, and we really want to make the Palais a space that is more shared. So we're using the idea or the legacy of making as a kind of inspiration behind a series of programs and uses of the building that will really involve sharing it with many of the organizations that we already work with, whether it is, you know, young people, schools, very different range of community organizations that we work with and we have been working with for many years. So this is kind of really rooted in the practices of Tate St. Ives, but it's taking it in a new direction, because now this will be a building that will be very unlike anything else that Tate is involved with in the town. And if I go back to the kinds of questions about what possibilities, if you like, are you leaving, as you might leave an organization such as this, and the Palais de Danse exists, this is really interesting, because it's not just us as curators that are making this, it's also in collaboration with the public. And it has already involved many public consultations, and it will continue in that vein. So for me, I think that's one of the most exciting ways of how we're moving forward in terms of essentially collectively curating this institution.
So much, and those threads for me when we had our first conversation really did stand out as you were just laying out many of the projects that you recall and that you felt very strongly about. And I think the question of some of the ways in which the hub kind of became a methodology that actually went from the museum into art in general as well, with the kind of convenings you have and the partnerships you generated. In Tate's constellation, let's say, the methodology of the transnational, which is something that the institution has kind of repeatedly articulated and redefined for itself as a collecting guideline strategy, but also in this case a really interesting interaction between that in St. Ives versus the museums of in London, to think about how the transnational meets the local. I don't love to use that word, but I think there is something about the specificity that you were laying out of this particular town, both in its art historical specificity, but also in the kind of socioeconomic, ecological, and other factors that distinguish it. And so perhaps we could hear a bit more from you about the ways in which the transnational has fed your work, but also ways in which there is perhaps some tension as well in a place like St. Ives, which has still an enormous number of artists perhaps living there, and then some of the names and the program that you've had do speak to, as you said, some of the most critical voices anywhere in the world who have the opportunity to come and show here, and that you hope to connect with this history. I'll leave it at that and let you respond.
Yeah, it's a really. Is it on? Yeah. Oh, his is off. I think it's a really important question because there is perhaps sometimes this assumption in our world that you can only generate these kinds of discussions in major cities. And what I found in moving to this remote and rural location, I mean, in most years there's less than 11,000 people in this town, and now I'm one of those residents after living in a city with millions of people. But the issues that some of the artists have addressed in terms of, environmental damage, climate change, extraction, land rights, cultural identity in its many forms, these are all issues that also the Transnational Centre deals with. But I suppose in our location it has also kind of a different nuance maybe, in that it's closer to the ground, and that also the interaction with our audiences and the relationship between artist and audience is really much closer. And it's interesting to think about the two models I presented before in terms of museum as hub and what now. I was thinking a lot after you asked me these questions, and it's also about who are your audiences, who are your constituencies. And in each of those city-based projects, it was really artists, curators, thinkers, people already invested and people already with a lot of knowledge. And we have that in Tate St. Ives as well, but it's also this much broader community, and with that comes a real sense of responsibility, if you like, to think carefully about your programming and which artists you invite and why. But that relationship between Tate St. Ives and the transnational and these central initiatives is actually, interestingly, is getting stronger. So for example, O.T. Pieski, after her exhibition at Tate St. Ives, became part of a program at Tate Modern, and this, so they kind of integrate certain programs and certain subject matter, if you like, into those larger investigations. And for us, it's very important to be part of that larger Tate research or ongoing inquiry, because we are still Tate, even if we're in a very different physical location.
Thank you. And I guess related to that, but you mentioned the residency as being a kind of unique aspect of Tate St. Ives, but also to connect it back to maybe the kind of situations that Pooja was discussing, to think about canons and a historical presence of this collection and of this now fairly remote history, let's say,
Yeah.
to the artists who might be coming into these residencies, and how it'd be interesting to just hear about some of the ways in which they've engaged those histories. I know you have a special interest and scholarly expertise in some of the artists that Tate St. Ives and St. Ives in general has been home to, and how do you see that within your role as director and curator there, kind of bringing those histories into kind of new readings as well?
Artists have done it in different ways. Some artists come on a residency and they might not necessarily be inspired or intrigued by those specific modernist histories, but by something else that is more perhaps either, if you like, a context of the larger region. So for example, Cornwall is a really interesting place in that it spans the Neolithic to the Space Age. It has multiple Neolithic monuments around the landscape, and also has a space center. So artists are often interested in ideas of like deep time. So they come and they can explore ideas such as that, and then others have a very direct or response to either the legacies of Barbara Hepworth, always kind of feeding it back into their own practice, however. So it's interesting to see how each one responds. I mean, so for example, Hera, she responded also to the invisible social histories of women's labour in St. Ives, which she didn't know she was going to explore when she came. She had been exploring kind of geological strata and looking at ideas of identity and layering. But then in that research, she encountered the person who ran the local archive and became intensely interested in those histories that had never been surfaced. So that is an example with her of how she will bring out things that Tate St. Ives has never represented. And that for us, I think, is really interesting to have these kind of questions and provocations from artists who are part of the program.
Yeah, thank you. I want to open it up in the interest of time to questions as well. And I know, we have a very...
back first?
Yeah, we'll start with Anindo in the back, and then...
Anindo here. I remember visiting the Ottawa exhibition and I really liked it. And in the context of transnational, I remember she examined the mining legacies, and I remember having a conversation about Cornwall also having a mining legacy. And so therefore, how do you engage with a place, even if you're not directly engaging, there is scope for conversation. That's a memory that comes back. My question, taking forward Ratan's point, is in terms of engagement with the local artists, because I remember speaking to a lot of local artists there as well. And so are there any tangible aspects to your programming, like say access to a solo exhibition in your programming? Like in 3 years you have one exhibition by local artist, Mohammed referred to it yesterday in his thing, or say a group exhibition, or access to residencies that you have within your Tate St. Ives program? Or do you have certain things where you can feed back to the larger Tate ecosystem where contemporary artists practicing in St. Ives have access to the Tate infrastructure, say in London or beyond? Things like that.
Yes, and it's a really important question because it is about that very specific context in which we're working. So we do, and we have done solo exhibitions by artists living and working in Cornwall, and we also work with, for example, local performers, and so either in collaboration with international groups or on their own. So they're very much part of our program because in a sense they are also the artists of today, and our gallery exists because of the artists who came there initially back in 1939 in the early years of the Second World War. But we recognize that we're part of a very, an ecosystem that is very much alive. So we do commission new work by artists based in Cornwall. Ro Robertson has a major piece right now in one of our galleries. So it is it's something we're very conscious of, and something that I think will only deepen in the future. It's also important to say that when we invite these artists, they come to probably one of the most beautiful artist studios I've ever seen, where the studios look right out onto the ocean and they have kind of floor-to-ceiling windows. But these are artists, these are studios where artists who are based in Cornwall have been there for many, many years. So there's also this real dialogue that happens in both senses of that word that is also enriching, I think, for both.
Let's take another question.
Let's take all areas.
Okay.
Yeah. No.
So hello, Anne. Thank you for that very fascinating presentation. Something you said really spoke to me, that the evolution or the development of an institution is not necessarily about expansion,
No.
but editing things out. So I'm really curious, can you just give a few more instances of that?
Yes.
In the institutions you've worked or beyond it? Thank you.
Yes. So, for example, when I arrived at Art in General, it was one of the things that attracted me to it because it was doing so many different programs. I mean, a myriad of programs that you could hardly imagine that smaller group of people could actually be realizing. But what that also meant was that, its identity was, it had a kind of plural identity, and in a way it felt like you needed to do fewer things better. And so it ended up in that instance, which is the opposite of Tate St. Ives actually, that we ended up feeling that the institution, as small as we were, we couldn't properly support a schools program alongside kind of adult education or public programming. So we decided to focus on our core constituency, which was adult artists and adult visitors, and to try and do that as best we could. And so we actually ceased certain strands of programming, which is really hard. I mean, it was very painful, but at the same time, we knew that we had so few resources there that we had to really focus and then deepen, which are the kinds of processes that I was describing, and that kind of process of ongoing self-analysis as an institution to make sure that you evolve with your times. So that's a very concrete example of one of those.
There's another question back. There's one more back there from someone in the US.
So mine was similar to hers. Is that, I mean, you're doing a lot for the local artists, residencies, etc., and engagement program. So what is it? I mean, what has been the metrics to gain more audiences, specific, given this place where you are in?
Yes.
I mean, we all go to London, we don't make it to St. Ives.
Yeah.
So how do you bring in these audiences? And if at all, like, is it a blockbuster show, or what has been the show that, or the kind of programming that you've done in the past that has brought in a large audiences, not only from the region but even from outside? Which one show or program that has been done even maybe before you or during your time?
It's a complex question to answer. There will always be a large group of people, a larger audience for anything that relates directly to the history of the place. So, for example, we always know that if we do a Barbara Hepworth exhibition, or we just had an exhibition by Ithel Cahoon, who spent most of her life in Cornwall, that exhibition will get a very high percentage of local and regional visitors because it directly relates to that history, as well as getting national and international press. So I think our focus is always on both, because you don't want to be completely invisible. You want to have the work of those artists recognized and acknowledged, but at the same time, you're very conscious that you need to relate it back to place. With the other artists that have been invited that don't have a connection with those histories, I mean, there have been several. I wouldn't say there's any one show that has kind of been like this, but what has been really interesting to see is that these are all artists that no one has heard of in Cornwall. And we're very conscious of that, but it was about that process of thinking about whose work would really have meaning, I suppose, there in terms of the critical issues that they're discussing, that would also resonate on a local level. And generalizing terribly, but for example, we know that issues around land rights, extraction, climate, these things are very important and always have been on a local level as well as on a global level. And so for example, for OTPSK's show, people came back 6 or 7 times. For Małgorzata Mirgatas, they came back multiple times because the show was dealing with kind of complex issues around identity, Roma identity, but it also had this, several exhibitions have this real sense of materiality that is also very much part of the history, if you like, or the interest of audiences. So it kind of taps in to interests that operate on many levels, from kind of conceptual to material.
Hi, I'm Shumona.
Hello.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I head a museums program. It's called DAG Museums within the wider ambit of a gallery called DAG or Delhi Art Gallery. My colleagues Ankon and Upasana are also in the room. But we're in the process of setting up a museum actually across the road. And so I was really interested in this process of like public consultations and what that means. Would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure.
And because we also don't exist as a museum right now, we work a lot through various collaborations with state archives, with national museums, etc., educational spaces. So I guess I wanted to learn a little bit more about the nature of these institutional collaborations, where the center is, who's at the periphery, what are the modes of exchange.
Yes.
And often we find that we're often collaborating with individuals rather than institutions, really, because these institutions are really rigid, and then we have to find our ways within them through an excited archivist or a very enthusiastic educator.
Yeah.
So just wanted to know, when there are more formal collaborations like this, not the kind of rogue ones we try to attempt, how those shape up and what that really results in. What are the possibilities of true institutional collaboration and exchange?
Thank you for asking that,
Thank
because I didn't have a chance to address it in after the final slide. So my colleagues, both before and now, when I put up that word that suggested community program, there is no kind of community program as such, but it was meant to encapsulate the audiences that we've been engaging with, or the groups we've been engaging with for many years, and these involve local schools and local colleges in a sustained manner. They involve actually a group of so-called older people called the Look Groups, which is a bit like a book group, and they started coming to Tate St. Ives and using it as a resource, a kind of visual resource rather than as a literary one. And they in fact are all now self-organized. So they evolved not from one group, but to multiple groups across Cornwall. So that was a really interesting example of how that grew very naturally without us afterwards. We have worked with the town of St. Ives on projects that we describe as for and with the town. So for example, we have collaborated over multiple months on the creation of artist projects, working with discrete groups in St. Ives, anything from the Lifeboat Association to the Community Orchard to La Salvation Army, many groups that have then committed to having very intense dialogues with artists over a period of many months, and then collaborating on the implementation of that project, for example. But alongside, we have regular programs where we use our space for many structured visits to Tate St. Ives, but we make sure to always also work outside. So we have a series of new initiatives. We just did one, my colleagues just did one with an organization called Hospital Rooms, for example. So we're increasingly working with the healthcare sector, social prescribing, and areas of well-being, because we know that that is one of the most critically important issues for Cornwall and for residents of Cornwall. So we're kind of working through various routes and various non-art routes actually, in order to develop new audiences and provide a space where they can gather. And the Palais particularly will be that, because it's not climate controlled. It's not a space which is going to be a classic museum. It may have several works by Hepworth in it, not many, because the museum across the street has everything in terms of the museum. So it's much more of a space where people can gather and not necessarily have a structured museum visit, for example. So we expect that new things will really come out of that. It has a sprung dance floor and a stage, which is one of the most exciting things because it means we can offer opportunities to local groups for dance and so that they can use it as for rehearsal space, for example. So that's the way that we want to make that space more permeable and a kind of space that people use regularly alongside our own programming.
There's an online question, a question there was, I think she's answered your question.
Yeah, to a lot extent.
So
But
shall we take the other questions then?
yeah,
Yeah? So you really just answered the question.
Okay.
You want to make the comment?
yeah. My question was more like how much of local feedback kind of filters into your programs, and how much you kind of participate or let the local voice gets heard through the program itself. Are they able to be authors of that questions? I shared authorship.
Yes.
You can just ask this question
Okay.
and this question there and you see what you feel like that.
The question online is from Sudeshna Shaha. She says, what are the ethical dilemmas of being a curator, or the problems and challenges you face throughout your career?
Wow. It's a lifetime of answering.
No lunch break.
No lunch break.
Why do you think of that?
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Anne. This is Christian, independent researcher. And while you were talking about non-art ways, I was thinking about the scope of projects which deal with communities, because I work with sex workers and their legacies. So I was thinking that what are the modes of exhibiting that challenge exhibition itself, and when the exhibition space becomes a space of a political space. Also, I was wondering about non-spaces like which are outside of galleries and museums, and while working with communities of sex workers, I was looking into their legacies, their material objects. They were often trafficked from different countries, or they have themselves, reached Calcutta, and they have certain objects which then that kind of speak of the journeys of two homes and of placemaking. So, what is the scope of of an exhibition like this, which challenges the concept of curating, because the sex workers themselves have an essence of collection. They are collectors themselves. There's care in their collection. They are curators themselves. So when the community becomes curators themselves, and so what are the modes with which we can kind of negotiate these spaces, and what is the scope that you like to suggest? Yeah. Thank you.
Good question. But there is a kind of thread of
There is.
ethics and
I might just give a couple, at least for Tate St. Ives, I can give a couple of examples of how, for example, we have worked with particular audiences, and this is the work of my colleagues. It's not directly me in this instance, but so, for example, the things that are always less visible because they're not an exhibition program is the work that, as an institution and colleagues have done around like suicide prevention, which is a big issue in Cornwall. So is poverty. LGBTQIA young people. We've worked with a group for several years now, and some of that work is done outside and not in the gallery, and some of it happens in the gallery, and some of it results in artwork that is made, produced and exhibited in the gallery, as well as outside. So there are different ways, I think, of working. Some of them are multi-year, and then some of them arise because of specific need. And then as a gallery, I suppose, we are responsive to what we see and what we hear. And that relates to the question that was asked before, is that I don't know, I mean, this is something that probably wouldn't have been applicable in the New Museum and art in general because of the kind of artist-focused spaces that they were at the time. But we also have what was called a community liaison group. And this is a group of local people, kind of artists, civic people, shop owners, like a whole variety of people that we meet with regularly, and they act as a sounding board. So they act as a sounding board for our program. We also have an advisory council that is kind of maybe more formal, but the community liaison group is actually people living and working in the town, on the ground. And most of them are not necessarily in the art world. So that is where we get a lot of like real feedback, not just to the exhibitions and programs, but also the kind of the feelings on the ground. And the palette is really important in this instance of what would mean something for us to help support or to help create or co-curate or to give over space for something else or for other people to organize that. And the public consultations we have had have involved several hundred people so far, and it will continue. And because some of these are contested things, you know, not everybody feels the same way about an artistic legacy, and not everyone feels the same way about the use of the space in the future. And people imagine it in so many different ways, probably more ways than we could ever deliver. So at some point we'll have to make some choices about what we can properly support. But it will be done through that feedback, and it will be done in that way.
Thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for. Please, a round of applause for Anne.